The evening air was thick with humidity as Sarah Mitchell stepped out of her rental car and looked up at the neon sign flickering above the entrance of Murphy's Bar. The establishment sat on the edge of Camp Pendleton, a notorious watering hole where Marines came to blow off steam after grueling training exercises. Tonight, Sarah wasn't here as General Mitchell, the decorated three-star general who commanded respect across military installations worldwide. Tonight, she was simply a woman in civilian clothes, seeking a quiet drink and a moment of anonymity. Sarah had deliberately chosen casual attire for her impromptu visit to the area. Dressed in simple jeans, a plain white t-shirt, and worn sneakers, she looked nothing like the commanding officer whose picture hung in military offices across the country. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the regulation bun she typically wore, and she'd left her military bearing at the door. After 30 years of service, she had learned the value of occasionally stepping out of uniform to observe how her troops behaved when they thought no one was watching. The bar's interior was exactly what she'd expected. Dimly lit, filled with the sounds of clinking glasses, loud conversations, and classic rock music playing from speakers mounted in the corners. The smell of beer and fried food hung heavy in the air, mixed with the unmistakable scent of military-issued soap and aftershave. Round tables filled the center of the room, while a long wooden bar stretched along one wall, its surface scarred from years of use. Sarah chose a corner booth, sliding in with her back to the wall, a habit ingrained from decades of military service. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire room, while remaining relatively inconspicuous. She ordered a beer from the young waitress who approached, a girl who couldn't have been much older than 20, with tired eyes and a forced smile. The bar was moderately crowded for a Wednesday evening. Most patrons were indeed Marines, easily identifiable by their bearing even in civilian clothes. The straight backs, the watchful eyes, the way they carried themselves with purpose even while relaxing. Some sat in small groups sharing war stories or complaining about their commanding officers. Others played pool near the back of the establishment, their competitive nature evident in every shot. Sarah had been nursing her beer for about 20 minutes when the door burst open, admitting a group of 5 Marines who commanded immediate attention. Their voices carried across the room as they made their way to the bar, clearly having already consumed alcohol elsewhere. The leader of the group was a tall, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped blonde hair and the kind of swagger that spoke of someone who had never been seriously challenged. His name tag read Johnson, and the stripes on his civilian jacket indicated he was a sergeant. "Bartender!" Johnson called out, slapping his hand on the bar surface. "5 beers and make them cold. We're celebrating another successful day of showing these recruits what real Marines look like." His companions laughed and nodded in agreement, settling onto bar stools with the casual arrogance of men who believed they owned whatever space they occupied. Sarah watched them with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades managing personalities exactly like these, competent soldiers whose confidence had crossed the line into cockiness, potentially problematic if left unchecked. The group's conversation grew louder as they consumed their drinks, their topics ranging from boastful accounts of training exercises to crude commentary about their fellow service members. Sarah found herself increasingly disturbed by their lack of professionalism, even in this off-duty setting. These weren't just young soldiers letting off steam. These were experienced non-commissioned officers whose behavior reflected poorly on the corps they claimed to represent. "You see that pathetic excuse for a platoon we had to work with today?" Johnson continued, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "I swear, the corps is getting soft. In my day, we didn't coddle people who couldn't keep up. You either made the cut or you got out." One of his companions, a shorter man with dark hair and multiple tattoos covering his arms, nodded enthusiastically. "Remember that female lieutenant who tried to tell us how to run PT yesterday? I wanted to laugh in her face. What's she know about real military training? Women in the military." Johnson shook his head dramatically. "Don't get me wrong, I'm all for equal opportunity, but some of these positions should be earned, not handed out because someone's checking boxes for diversity. Half these female officers wouldn't last 5 minutes in real combat." Sarah's jaw tightened as she listened to the conversation. These attitudes weren't just inappropriate. They were exactly the kind of thinking that undermined unit cohesion and military effectiveness. She had spent her entire career proving that leadership wasn't about gender, size, or any other superficial characteristic. It was about competence, dedication, and the ability to inspire others to achieve their best. The waitress approached Johnson's group to take their food order, and Sarah watched as the sergeant's behavior became even more objectionable. He made inappropriate comments about her appearance, spoke to her as if she were intellectually inferior, and generally treated her with the kind of disrespect that made Sarah's blood boil. The young woman handled it professionally, but Sarah could see the discomfort in her posture and the forced nature of her smile. "Hey, sweetheart," Johnson called after the waitress as she started to walk away. "Make sure that food comes out hot, and if it doesn't, you'll be hearing from me personally." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. The waitress nodded quickly and hurried toward the kitchen, clearly eager to escape the interaction. Sarah took a long sip of her beer, considering her options. Her first instinct was to intervene immediately, to use her authority to address this behavior directly. However, she recognized that revealing her identity now might not be the most effective approach. Sometimes the best way to understand a problem was to observe it fully before taking action. The group's conversation continued, growing more boisterous and inappropriate with each round of drinks. They shared stories that painted civilians in derogatory terms, mocked other service members who they deemed inferior, and generally displayed the kind of attitudes that Sarah had worked tirelessly to eliminate from modern military culture. "The thing is," Johnson continued, gesturing broadly with his beer bottle, "respect has to be earned. You can't just put on a uniform and expect people to salute. Real leadership comes from proving yourself in the field, showing that you can handle whatever gets thrown at you." His words might have carried weight if they weren't being delivered by someone whose own behavior demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership actually meant. Sarah had seen countless soldiers like Johnson throughout her career, technically competent, but lacking the emotional intelligence and professional maturity necessary for true leadership. As the evening wore on, the group's behavior became increasingly problematic. They grew louder, more aggressive in their interactions with staff, and more dismissive of anyone they perceived as different from themselves. Sarah watched other patrons begin to give them a wide berth, the atmosphere in the bar shifting from relaxed to tense. The breaking point came when a young Marine corporal, clearly new to the area, approached their table hoping to join the conversation. The soldier was small in stature, with a nervous demeanor that immediately marked him as an outsider to Johnson's group. "Excuse me," the corporal said politely. "I'm new to the base and was hoping to meet some fellow Marines. Mind if I join you?" Johnson looked him up and down with obvious disdain, taking in the corporal's slight build and respectful manner. "What's your name, kid?" "Corporal Martinez. Sergeant. I just transferred here from Quantico." "Martinez," Johnson repeated, his tone making the name sound like something distasteful. "Let me guess. You're one of those diversity recruits they keep pushing through the system. Tell me, Martinez, what makes you think you belong at the same table as Marines who've actually earned their place?" The young corporal's face reddened, but he maintained his composure. "I graduated top of my class in basic training, Sergeant. I've completed advanced combat training and specialized communications courses. I think my record speaks for itself." Johnson's companions laughed, and the sergeant himself smiled with cruel amusement. "Your record? Kid, your record doesn't mean anything until you've proven yourself in the real world. And from where I'm sitting, you look like someone who'd fold the first time things got serious." Sarah's hands clenched into fists under the table. She had heard enough. This wasn't just inappropriate behavior. It was the kind of bullying and discrimination that had no place in any military organization. The young corporal was being humiliated for no reason other than Johnson's need to assert dominance and his prejudiced assumptions about what a Marine should look like. The confrontation escalated when Johnson stood up, using his considerable height advantage to intimidate the smaller man. "Here's some free advice, Martinez. Find somewhere else to drink. This table is for real Marines, not whatever it is you're pretending to be." Corporal Martinez's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. "Understood, Sergeant. I'll find another table." As the young Marine walked away, Sarah could see the humiliation in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged with disappointment and embarrassment. It was exactly the kind of moment that could define a young soldier's entire military experience, potentially driving away talented individuals who simply didn't fit someone's narrow definition of what a Marine should be. Johnson and his friends celebrated their perceived victory with another round of drinks, their laughter echoing across the bar. They had successfully asserted their dominance, reinforced their status as the alpha males of their little pack, and sent a clear message about who was and wasn't welcome in their presence. Sarah finished her beer and signaled the waitress for another. She had learned everything she needed to know about Sergeant Johnson and his attitudes, but the evening was far from over. She had decided to stay and continue observing, building a complete picture of the situation before determining the most appropriate course of action. The bar continued to fill with more patrons as the night progressed, but the atmosphere remained tense. Johnson's group had established themselves as the dominant presence in the room, their voices loud and their behavior increasingly aggressive. Other Marines kept their distance, some clearly recognizing that engaging with the group would likely lead to confrontation. Sarah watched as the waitress continued to endure inappropriate comments and treatment from Johnson's table. The young woman's professionalism was admirable, but Sarah could see the stress taking its toll. Each trip to their table seemed to drain a little more of her energy, her smile becoming more forced with every interaction. The situation reminded Sarah of her own early days in the military, when she had faced similar attitudes and challenges. The difference was that she had been fortunate enough to serve under leaders who recognized talent regardless of packaging, who gave her opportunities to prove herself based on merit rather than appearance. Not everyone was so lucky, and she had made it her mission to ensure that future generations of service members would have better experiences than she had. As the clock approached 10 p.m., Sarah realized she had been in the bar for over 2 hours, carefully observing and taking mental notes. Johnson's group showed no signs of moderating their behavior. If anything, the alcohol had made them more vocal about their prejudices and more aggressive in their interactions with others. The time had come for Sarah to make a decision about how to proceed. She could continue observing, gathering more evidence of the problematic attitudes and behaviors she was witnessing. She could leave quietly and address the situation through official channels, using her observations to initiate formal investigations and corrective actions. Or she could take a more direct approach, one that might provide immediate education for everyone involved. End quote. Sarah Mitchell had not become a 3-star general by avoiding difficult situations or backing down from challenges. She had earned her rank through competence, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the values that made the military strong. Tonight, those values were being undermined by soldiers who should have known better, and she was in a unique position to address the problem directly. The question was whether to reveal her identity now or continue her observation a bit longer. Either way, Sergeant Johnson and his friends were about to receive an education they would never forget. Sarah had just decided to continue her observation when the situation took a turn that forced her hand. A young woman in civilian clothes entered Murphy's bar, immediately drawing the attention of Johnson's group. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with short auburn hair and the confident posture of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Despite her casual dress, there was something about her bearing that suggested military training. The woman approached the bar and ordered a drink, clearly intending to mind her own business. However, Johnson's alcohol-fueled confidence had reached the point where he felt entitled to comment on anyone who entered his sphere of awareness. "Well, well," Johnson announced loudly, nudging his companions. "Looks like we've got fresh meat walking in. What do you think, boys? Military or civilian?" His friends turned to examine the newcomer, their gazes invasive and unwelcome. The woman at the bar stiffened slightly, clearly aware she was being discussed but choosing to ignore the attention. "Definitely military," one of Johnson's companions declared. "Look at that posture. Probably some butterbar who thinks she knows everything about leadership because she read it in a textbook." Johnson stood up from his table, swaying slightly from the effects of his evening's consumption. "I think it's time we introduced ourselves. Show her how real Marines welcome newcomers to the area." Sarah watched with growing concern as Johnson approached the young woman. She had seen this scenario play out before, and it rarely ended well. The combination of alcohol, male aggression, and misplaced confidence was a volatile mix, especially when directed at someone who might be a fellow service member. "Evening, miss," Johnson said, inserting himself between the woman and the bar. "I couldn't help but notice you walked in here with purpose. You military?" The woman turned to face him, her expression polite but guarded. "Good evening." "Yes, I am. I knew it," Johnson declared triumphantly, as if he'd accomplished something significant. "What's your rank and unit?" The directness of the question was inappropriate in a civilian setting, but the woman answered with professional courtesy. Second Lieutenant Rebecca Chen, Marine Corps Intelligence. Johnson's companions laughed, and the sergeant himself smiled with obvious condescension. Intelligence, huh? Let me guess. You're one of those book-smart officers who thinks analyzing reports makes you a warrior. Tell me, Lieutenant Chen, how much actual field experience do you have? Lieutenant Chen's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. I've completed all required training and have served in 2 deployments overseas. My experience and qualifications were deemed sufficient for my current assignment. Required training, Johnson repeated mockingly. That's cute. You know what separates real Marines from paper pushers? Blood, sweat, and the willingness to do whatever it takes when everything goes to hell. Not sitting in air-conditioned offices reading reports and pretending to understand warfare. Sarah felt her temper rising as she watched the confrontation unfold. Lieutenant Chen was handling herself professionally, but she shouldn't have to endure this kind of harassment from a fellow Marine. The young officer was clearly outnumbered and in a vulnerable position, surrounded by Johnson's friends who were encouraging his behavior with their laughter and comments. I respect your experience, Sergeant, Chen replied diplomatically. However, intelligence work is crucial to mission success. The reports I analyze and the briefings I prepare help keep Marines safe in the field. Johnson stepped closer, using his height and bulk to intimidate her.
Keep Marines safe?
Lady, the only thing that keeps Marines safe is being stronger, faster, and meaner than whatever they're fighting. Not some college graduate with a computer telling us what she thinks might happen. The situation was escalating beyond acceptable bounds. Johnson's behavior had crossed the line from inappropriate commentary to active harassment of a fellow service member. Sarah could see that Lieutenant Chen, despite her professional composure, was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the aggressive nature of the confrontation. You know what your problem is? Johnson continued. Emboldened by the attention from his friends and the lack of intervention from other bar patrons, you think putting on a uniform automatically earns you respect. But respect has to be earned, and from where I'm standing, you haven't done anything to earn mine. One of Johnson's companions joined the conversation, apparently deciding that ganging up on the lieutenant would be entertaining.
The sergeant's got a point.
I've seen plenty of officers who look good on paper but fold when the pressure's on. What makes you think you're any different? Lieutenant Chen's face flushed with anger, but she maintained her military bearing. I don't need to prove anything to you. I've earned my rank through performance and dedication, and I don't appreciate being interrogated in a civilian establishment. Oh, you don't appreciate it? Johnson mocked. Well, that's too bad, because I don't appreciate having my military degraded by people who think they can skip the hard work and go straight to giving orders. The confrontation was attracting attention from other bar patrons, some of whom looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. However, none seemed inclined to intervene, either because they didn't want to get involved or because they were intimidated by Johnson's group. Sarah had seen enough. This was exactly the kind of toxic behavior that undermined military effectiveness and drove talented people away from service. Lieutenant Chen was being subjected to gender-based harassment disguised as professional criticism, and it was happening in front of an audience that included other Marines who should have known better. Standing up from her corner booth, Sarah approached the confrontation with the measured steps of someone accustomed to command authority. Her movement was subtle but purposeful, and several patrons noticed her approach without quite understanding why this middle-aged woman in casual clothes seemed suddenly significant.
Excuse me, Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to being obeyed.
Is there a problem here? Johnson turned toward her with obvious irritation, clearly annoyed by the interruption. No problem, ma'am. Just having a professional conversation with a fellow Marine. Nothing that concerns civilians. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly at the dismissive tone. Actually, I think it concerns me quite a bit. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and it seems like you're giving this young officer a hard time for no apparent reason. Listen, lady, Johnson said, his patience clearly wearing thin. I don't know who you think you are, but this is military business. Why don't you go back to your table and mind your own business? Johnson's friends chuckled at his dismissal of Sarah, apparently finding it amusing that some random woman thought she could involve herself in their affairs. They had no idea they were about to receive the education of their lives. Military business, Sarah repeated thoughtfully. You're right about that. And since I've spent the last 30 years dealing with military business, I think I'm qualified to have an opinion. Something in Sarah's tone caused Johnson to pause, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. However, his alcohol-fueled bravado quickly reasserted itself. 30 years? What? As a military spouse? That doesn't make you an expert on what it takes to be a real Marine. The assumption was exactly what Sarah had expected, and it crystallized everything that was wrong with Johnson's attitude. He had looked at her appearance, made assumptions based on gender and age, and dismissed her without any consideration of her actual qualifications or experience. Actually, Sarah replied with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes, I wasn't a military spouse. I was active duty. Still am, as a matter of fact. Johnson's expression shifted from dismissive to skeptical. Active duty? In what capacity? Well, let's see, Sarah said, her voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made it more intimidating rather than less. I started as an enlisted Marine 30 years ago, worked my way through the ranks, earned my commission through officer candidate school, commanded units in Iraq and Afghanistan, served in the Pentagon developing policy, and currently hold a position that requires me to evaluate the performance and professionalism of Marines across multiple installations. The confidence in Johnson's posture began to waver as he processed what he was hearing. The specific details and casual way Sarah delivered them suggested she wasn't bluffing, but he still couldn't quite believe that this ordinary-looking woman could be anyone important. Lieutenant Chen, meanwhile, had recognized something in Sarah's bearing that Johnson was missing. The way Sarah carried herself, the authority in her voice, and the specific knowledge she displayed were all indicators of someone with significant military experience and current responsibility. "What's your rank?" Johnson asked, his voice noticeably less aggressive than it had been moments before. "That's an interesting question," Sarah replied, "especially considering you never asked Lieutenant Chen to prove her rank before you started lecturing her about earning respect. But since you asked, I'm a general." The word hung in the air like a bombshell. Johnson's face went pale as the implications hit him, while his companions looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Around them, other bar patrons who had been listening to the conversation began to pay closer attention, realizing they were witnessing something significant. "A general?" Johnson repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. 3 stars, to be specific, Sarah confirmed. General Sarah Mitchell. "And I have to say, Sergeant Johnson, your conduct this evening has been absolutely disgraceful." The use of his name completed Johnson's shock. Not only was he facing a general officer he had just insulted and dismissed, but she somehow knew who he was. The realization that his behavior had been observed and evaluated by someone with the power to end his career hit him like a physical blow. Lieutenant Chen stepped forward slightly, recognizing an opportunity to escape the confrontation. "General Mitchell, it's an honor to meet you. I've read about your service record." Sarah nodded to the lieutenant while keeping her eyes on Johnson. "The honor is mine, Lieutenant Chen. Intelligence work is crucial to our mission effectiveness, and officers like you deserve respect from their fellow Marines, not harassment based on ignorant assumptions." Johnson's mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words. His friends had backed away from him as if he were contaminated, clearly hoping to distance themselves from the disaster that was unfolding. "General, I didn't know," Johnson stammered. "If I had known who you were," Sarah's expression remained stern. "If you had known who I was, what? You would have treated me with respect? What about Lieutenant Chen? What about that young corporal you humiliated earlier? What about every other person you've dismissed tonight based on your narrow-minded assumptions?" The questions hit Johnson like hammer blows. He realized that every interaction he'd had that evening had been observed and judged by someone whose opinion could determine his future in the Marine Corps. "The problem, Sergeant Johnson," Sarah continued, "isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you treated fellow Marines with disrespect and dismissed them based on superficial characteristics rather than their actual qualifications and contributions." Johnson's career flashed before his eyes as he contemplated the magnitude of his mistake. He had spent years building his reputation and advancing through the ranks, and now it all seemed in jeopardy because of one evening's poor judgment. "Ma'am, I apologize," he said, his voice shaking with the realization of his situation. "I was out of line. I let alcohol affect my judgment, and I said things I shouldn't have said." Sarah studied him for a long moment before responding. Your apology is noted, Sergeant. However, apologies don't undo the damage caused by your behavior. They don't erase the humiliation you inflicted on Lieutenant Chen and Corporal Martinez. They don't change the fact that other Marines witnessed your unprofessional conduct. The bar had gone completely quiet, every patron listening to the exchange with fascination. This was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years, the night when arrogant Marines learned that assumptions could be dangerous and respect should be universal. Johnson stood at attention instinctively, his military training overriding his civilian setting. His companions followed suit, creating a surreal scene of Marines in casual clothes, responding to military protocol in a neighborhood bar. "What happens now, ma'am?" Johnson asked, his voice reflecting his understanding that his future was entirely in Sarah's hands. Sarah looked around the bar, taking in the faces of everyone who had witnessed the evening's events. She saw young Marines who needed to learn valuable lessons about leadership and respect. She saw experienced service members who had allowed inappropriate behavior to continue unchecked. Most importantly, she saw an opportunity to turn a negative situation into a teachable moment that could have lasting positive effects. What happens now, Sergeant Johnson, depends on what you've learned from tonight's experience and how you choose to apply those lessons going forward. The silence in Murphy's bar stretched for several tense moments as everyone processed what had just occurred. General Sarah Mitchell stood calmly in the center of what had become an impromptu military formation, surrounded by Marines who were struggling to comprehend how dramatically their evening had shifted. The casual atmosphere of drinking and socializing had been replaced by the weight of military accountability and the recognition that careers hung in the balance. Sergeant Johnson remained at attention, sweat beading on his forehead despite the bar's air conditioning. His companions stood rigidly beside him, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. The transformation was remarkable. 5 minutes ago, they had been the dominant force in the room, loud and confident in their superiority. Now they looked like schoolchildren caught misbehaving by the principal. Lieutenant Chen maintained her professional bearing, but Sarah could see the mix of relief and vindication in her expression. The young officer had endured harassment with grace, and now she was witnessing her tormentors face the consequences of their actions. It was a moment that would likely stay with her throughout her military career, reinforcing the importance of maintaining dignity under pressure. Sarah allowed the silence to continue a bit longer, understanding that discomfort could be an excellent teacher. She had used this technique countless times throughout her career. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came from what wasn't said, rather than what was. The anticipation and uncertainty were forcing everyone present to confront their own assumptions and behaviors. "At ease," Sarah finally said, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades of command experience. The Marines relaxed slightly but remained alert, understanding that they were still very much under scrutiny. Sarah walked slowly around the group, her eyes taking in each face and assessing what she saw there. Johnson showed fear and shame, clearly understanding that his behavior had been unacceptable. His companions displayed varying degrees of regret and anxiety, some probably wondering if they would face consequences for their association with Johnson's actions. "Sergeant Johnson," Sarah began, her tone measured but firm, "you've apologized for your behavior tonight, and that's a start. However, I'm more interested in understanding the thinking that led to these actions. What made you believe it was appropriate to harass Lieutenant Chen?" Johnson swallowed hard before responding. "Ma'am, there's no excuse for my behavior. I let personal prejudices and alcohol cloud my judgment. I was wrong to question Lieutenant Chen's qualifications and to treat her with disrespect." "Personal prejudices," Sarah repeated. "Elaborate on that." The request clearly made Johnson uncomfortable, but he recognized that honesty was his only viable option. "Ma'am, I grew up believing that certain positions in the military should be held by people who fit a traditional image of what a warrior should look like. I know those beliefs are wrong, but I haven't always challenged them the way I should have." Sarah nodded, appreciating his candor. "And what about Corporal Martinez? What personal prejudices influenced your treatment of him?" Johnson's shoulders sagged as he recalled his earlier interaction with the young corporal. "I made assumptions about his background and capabilities based on his name and appearance. I treated him as if he hadn't earned his place in the Corps, which was completely inappropriate." "Indeed it was," Sarah agreed. Both Lieutenant Chen and Corporal Martinez have served honorably and earned their positions through merit. Your assumptions about their worthiness reveal more about your limitations than theirs. The general's words carried particular weight because they came from someone whose own career had challenged traditional assumptions about military leadership. Sarah's rise through the ranks had required overcoming exactly the kind of prejudices that Johnson had displayed, and her success proved that talent and dedication were more important than fitting conventional expectations. Now, Sarah continued, I want to address the broader implications of what I witnessed tonight. This wasn't just about Sergeant Johnson's individual actions. I observed other Marines who allowed inappropriate behavior to continue unchecked. I saw a pattern of thinking that undermines everything we claim to value as an organization. She gestured toward the other patrons in the bar, many of whom were also Marines who had watched the evening's events unfold without intervention. Leadership isn't just about rank or position. Every Marine has a responsibility to uphold our standards and protect fellow service members from harassment and discrimination. A young corporal near the bar raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what should we have done? Sergeant Johnson outranks most of us, and it seemed like he was just talking. Sarah appreciated the question because it addressed a common challenge in military culture. That's an excellent question, Corporal. The answer is that there are always appropriate ways to address problematic behavior, regardless of rank differences. You could have approached Lieutenant Chen to offer support. You could have attempted to redirect the conversation. You could have reported the incident to appropriate authorities. She paused to let the words sink in. What you cannot do is stand by and watch fellow Marines be mistreated because it's easier than getting involved. Our effectiveness as an organization depends on mutual respect and support, not on tolerating bullies because they hold certain positions. Lieutenant Chen stepped forward slightly. General Mitchell, if I may, I'd like to thank you for intervening tonight. It's encouraging to know that senior leadership is actively working to address these issues. Thank you, Lieutenant Chen, Sarah replied. But I want to be clear about something. You handled yourself extremely well tonight. You maintained your professionalism and dignity under pressure, which is exactly what we expect from our officers. I intervened because I had the authority and opportunity to do so, but you had already demonstrated the leadership qualities we need in the Corps. The praise was genuine and important. Sarah understood that moments like these could either reinforce positive behaviors or create lasting damage, depending on how they were handled. Lieutenant Chen needed to know that her response had been appropriate and that she wasn't somehow at fault for the harassment she had endured. Turning back to Johnson, Sarah continued her instruction. Sergeant, you mentioned that you've held certain beliefs about who belongs in military positions. I want you to understand something clearly. The Marine Corps doesn't exist to validate your personal preferences or prejudices. It exists to defend our nation, and that mission requires us to utilize the talents and capabilities of all qualified individuals. Johnson nodded earnestly. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Do you? Sarah challenged. Because understanding intellectually and changing behavior are two different things. I need to know that you're committed to examining your assumptions and actively working to treat all Marines with the respect they've earned. The question forced Johnson to confront the depth of change that would be required. It wasn't enough to simply apologize and promise to do better. He needed to acknowledge that his fundamental thinking was flawed and commit to the difficult work of changing ingrained attitudes. Ma'am, I recognize that I have work to do on myself, Johnson said carefully. I know that my attitudes have been wrong, and I'm committed to changing them. I want to be the kind of leader that brings out the best in all Marines, regardless of their background. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity versus mere self-preservation. That's what I want to hear, Sergeant. However, commitment to change requires more than words. It requires consistent actions over time, and it requires accountability. She pulled out her phone and made a note. I'm going to be following up on tonight's events through appropriate channels. Sergeant Johnson, you'll be hearing from your chain of command regarding additional training and counseling. This isn't about punishment. It's about professional development and ensuring that all Marines under your influence are treated appropriately. The prospect of formal follow-up clearly concerned Johnson, but he accepted it without protest. He understood that facing consequences was preferable to having his career ended entirely. What about the rest of you? Sarah asked. addressing Johnson's companions and the broader audience. What are your takeaways from tonight's events? One of Johnson's friends, a corporal named Williams, spoke up hesitantly. Ma'am, I think we've learned that we need to be more aware of how our words and actions affect other Marines. We got caught up in trying to impress each other and lost sight of our professional responsibilities. That's a good start, Sarah acknowledged. But I want to push you further. How will you ensure that you don't find yourself in similar situations in the future? Williams considered the question carefully. I think we need to actively support fellow Marines instead of just avoiding causing problems. If we see someone being treated unfairly, we need to speak up, even if it's uncomfortable. Sarah nodded approvingly. Exactly. Leadership requires moral courage, not just physical courage. It means doing the right thing even when it's difficult or unpopular. The conversation was attracting more attention from other bar patrons, many of whom were learning valuable lessons about leadership, respect, and accountability. Sarah recognized that this impromptu teaching moment had the potential to influence far more people than just those directly involved in the confrontation. I want to share something with all of you, Sarah said, raising her voice slightly to ensure everyone could hear. I didn't reveal my rank tonight to embarrass anyone or to assert authority for its own sake. I did it because I witnessed behavior that contradicts everything we claim to stand for as Marines. She paused to make eye contact with various individuals throughout the room. Every one of you took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That oath doesn't include exceptions for people who look different from you or who don't fit your preconceived notions of what a Marine should be. The words carried particular power, coming from someone who had clearly faced her own challenges in rising through the ranks. Sarah's success story was living proof that the Marine Corps could be better than its worst tendencies when it embraced merit over prejudice. Sergeant Johnson, Sarah continued, you mentioned earlier that respect must be earned. You're absolutely right about that. The question is, what have you done tonight to earn respect? How have your actions reflected the values you claim to uphold? Johnson's face showed clear recognition of his failure. Ma'am, my actions tonight have been disgraceful. I haven't earned anyone's respect. I've done the opposite. I've shown that I allowed prejudice to override my training and my responsibilities as a leader. And what about going forward? Sarah pressed. How will you earn the respect you seek? By treating every Marine with the dignity they deserve, Johnson replied. By judging them on their performance and character, not on superficial characteristics. By being the kind of leader I should have been all along. Sarah nodded, seeing genuine recognition in his response. That's exactly right, and I want everyone here to understand that this applies to all of us, regardless of rank or position. We all have the responsibility to create an environment where talent can flourish and where every Marine feels valued and supported. The lesson was beginning to resonate throughout the room, creating the kind of learning experience that could have lasting positive effects on military culture. Sarah realized that what had started as a troubling display of prejudice and harassment had evolved into an opportunity for genuine growth and improvement. As the impromptu lesson continued, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere in the bar had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a typical evening of Marines unwinding after duty had transformed into something far more significant. A moment of genuine learning and reflection that would likely influence everyone present for years to come. Young Corporal Martinez, who had been humiliated earlier in the evening, had quietly returned to witness the unfolding situation. Sarah saw him standing near the back of the room, his expression showing a mixture of vindication and cautious hope. She made a mental note to address his situation specifically before the evening concluded. I want to talk about something that many of you may not have considered, Sarah continued, her voice carrying easily across the now silent bar. The behavior I witnessed tonight doesn't just affect the immediate targets. It creates a culture that discourages talent, undermines unit cohesion, and ultimately makes us less effective as a fighting force. She gestured toward Lieutenant Chen. When you dismiss an intelligence officer's contributions, you're not just being rude to one person. You're potentially compromising mission effectiveness by devaluing critical information and analysis. When you humiliate a young Marine based on his appearance, you're not just hurting his feelings. You're possibly driving away someone who could become an exceptional leader. The practical implications of prejudice and harassment were often overlooked in favor of focusing solely on moral arguments. Sarah understood that connecting bad behavior to mission impact could be more persuasive than appeals to fairness alone. Sergeant Johnson shifted uncomfortably as he processed the broader implications of his actions. "General, I never thought about it that way. I was focused on what I thought were standards, but I wasn't considering the bigger picture." "That's exactly the problem," Sarah replied. "Real standards are about performance, dedication, and character. Fake standards are about appearance, background, and conformity to arbitrary expectations. Tonight, you confused the two, and that confusion led to harmful behavior." She walked over to where Corporal Martinez was standing, gesturing for him to join the main group. "Corporal Martinez, would you please come here? I believe Sergeant Johnson has something to say to you." Martinez approached hesitantly, his earlier confidence clearly shaken by his encounter with Johnson's group. The young Marine had been trying to make connections and build relationships, only to face rejection and humiliation based on prejudiced assumptions about his worth. Johnson looked at Martinez with obvious shame, recognizing the full impact of his earlier behavior. "Corporal Martinez, I owe you a sincere apology. My treatment of you tonight was completely inappropriate and unprofessional. I made assumptions about you based on ignorance and prejudice, and I'm deeply sorry." Martinez maintained his military bearing, but Sarah could see the emotional impact of receiving a public apology from someone who had hurt him. "Thank you, Sergeant. I accept your apology." "More than that," Johnson continued, clearly understanding that words alone were insufficient. "I'd like to invite you to join us for drinks sometime, as equals and fellow Marines. I want to get to know you as the person and Marine you actually are, not the stereotype I created in my head." The offer represented a genuine attempt at reconciliation, and Sarah appreciated Johnson's recognition that rebuilding trust would require ongoing effort rather than a single gesture. "That's a generous offer, Sergeant," Martinez replied diplomatically. "I'd be open to that." Sarah turned to address the broader audience again, recognizing that this teachable moment had even greater potential. "What we're witnessing here is how real leaders handle mistakes. Sergeant Johnson made serious errors in judgment tonight, but he's taking responsibility and committing to change. That's what we should expect from each other." She paused to let the lesson sink in. "However, I want everyone to understand that the goal isn't just to recover from mistakes, it's to avoid making them in the first place, and that requires constant vigilance about our own assumptions and biases." A staff sergeant near the bar raised his hand. "General, how do we balance maintaining high standards with being inclusive? I mean, not everyone who serves is going to be equally capable." It was an intelligent question that got to the heart of many concerns about military modernization. Sarah appreciated the opportunity to address it directly. "Outstanding question, Staff Sergeant. The answer is that real inclusiveness actually reinforces high standards rather than undermining them. When you judge people based on their actual performance rather than superficial characteristics, you're more likely to identify and develop real talent." She gestured around the room. "Look at the diversity of people who have excelled in military service throughout history. Some were big and intimidating, others were small and quick. Some came from military families, others had never seen a uniform before enlisting. What they had in common was dedication, courage, and the ability to contribute to mission success." The explanation resonated with many of the Marines present, who had seen examples of unexpected excellence throughout their own careers. Military service had a way of revealing character that couldn't be predicted from appearance or background. "Lieutenant Chen," Sarah continued, "would you share your experience with the group? What contributions have you made through your intelligence work?" Chen stepped forward, clearly appreciating the opportunity to speak about her professional accomplishments. "Certainly, General. In my last deployment, our intelligence analysis identified patterns in enemy communications that led to preventing 3 planned attacks on coalition forces. We saved lives by providing accurate, timely information to commanders in the field." The concrete example of professional accomplishment was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. It demonstrated that Chen's contributions were measured in terms of mission success and lives saved, not arbitrary standards about appearance or background. "And what about your technical qualifications?" Sarah prompted. "I hold advanced degrees in computer science and Middle Eastern studies. I speak 4 languages fluently, and I've completed specialized training in signals intelligence and cyber warfare," Chen replied. My evaluations have consistently rated me in the top 5% of my peer group. The recitation of qualifications was impressive and served to highlight how foolish Johnson's dismissive attitude had been. Chen was clearly an exceptional officer, whose contributions were valuable and measurable. Johnson's face showed clear recognition of his error. Lieutenant Chen, I owe you more than just an apology. I completely misjudged your qualifications and contributions. Your work sounds incredible, and I was an idiot to dismiss it. Thank you, Sergeant, Chen replied graciously. I appreciate that, and I hope this experience helps all of us remember to give fellow Marines the respect they've earned. Sarah was pleased with how the conversation was developing. Both Johnson and Chen were demonstrating the kind of professionalism that made military organizations effective, the ability to move past conflict toward mutual respect and cooperation. Now I want to talk about leadership responsibility, Sarah said, addressing the entire group. Every Marine in this room has influence over others, regardless of rank. The way you treat people, the standards you model, and the behaviors you tolerate all contribute to military culture. She made eye contact with various individuals as she spoke. Some of you are thinking that you're just corporals or lance corporals, that you don't have real leadership responsibility. That's wrong. Junior Marines look up to you, civilian communities observe you, and your actions reflect on all of us. The point was important because it extended responsibility beyond formal leadership positions. Military effectiveness depended on everyone taking ownership of standards and culture, not just those in command roles. What I want to see going forward, Sarah continued, is each of you taking active responsibility for creating an environment where all Marines can succeed. That means speaking up when you see inappropriate behavior, supporting fellow Marines who face challenges, and judging people based on their contributions rather than superficial characteristics. A young lance corporal near the front of the group raised her hand. General, what if we're not sure whether something we're seeing is actually inappropriate? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between normal military banter and actual harassment. Sarah nodded, recognizing the legitimacy of the concern. That's a fair question, Lance Corporal. When in doubt, ask yourself a simple question. Is this behavior making someone feel welcomed and valued as a team member, or is it making them feel excluded and diminished? If it's the latter, it's probably inappropriate. The guideline was simple but practical, providing a clear standard that could be applied in various situations. Sarah had found that complex rules were often ignored, while simple principles could guide behavior effectively. Additionally, Sarah added, consider whether you would be comfortable having your behavior observed by your commanding officer, your family, or the media. If the answer is no, you should probably reconsider your actions. The evening was winding down, but Sarah recognized that there were still important lessons to convey. She had turned an unfortunate situation into a powerful teaching moment, but the real test would come in how these Marines applied what they had learned in future situations. Before we conclude, Sarah said, I want to make something clear about tonight's events. Sergeant Johnson will face appropriate administrative action for his behavior, but my primary goal isn't punishment, it's prevention. I want to ensure that future Marines don't have to endure the kind of treatment that Lieutenant Chen and Corporal Martinez experienced tonight. Johnson nodded solemnly, understanding that accountability was necessary for both individual growth and organizational change. I'm also going to be implementing some changes based on what I observed, Sarah continued. There will be enhanced training on professional conduct, stricter oversight of off-duty behavior, and clearer reporting mechanisms for Marines who experience harassment or discrimination. The announcement indicated that tonight's events would have lasting institutional impact beyond just the individuals involved. Sarah understood that real change required systematic approaches rather than just addressing individual incidents. Finally, Sarah concluded, I want each of you to remember that you represent something larger than yourselves. You wear a uniform that symbolizes service, sacrifice, and excellence. Your behavior, both on and off duty, either honors that symbolism or undermines it. She looked around the room one final time, seeing faces that reflected genuine understanding and commitment. Tonight could have been just another example of the problems that sometimes plague military culture. Instead, it became an opportunity for learning and growth. I'm counting on all of you to ensure that the lessons we've discussed continue to influence your actions long after this evening ends. The transformation in the bar's atmosphere was remarkable. Where there had been tension and conflict, there was now understanding and commitment. Where there had been division based on prejudice, there was now unity based on shared values and mutual respect. As Marines began to disperse, Sarah noticed something significant happening. Instead of the clear social divisions that had characterized the evening's beginning, Marines of different ranks and backgrounds were talking together, sharing contact information, and making plans for future interactions. Johnson was engaged in earnest conversation with both Chen and Martinez, clearly working to repair the damage caused by his earlier behavior. The evening had proven that even difficult situations could become catalysts for positive change when handled with courage, wisdom, and commitment to something greater than individual comfort. General Sarah Mitchell had reminded everyone present why the military's highest values were worth defending, and she had demonstrated that leadership wasn't about rank or authority. It was about standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. As she prepared to leave Murphy's bar, Sarah reflected on the evening's events with satisfaction. She had witnessed the worst of military culture, but she had also seen its potential for growth and redemption. Most importantly, she had reminded a group of Marines that their greatest strength lay not in their ability to exclude and intimidate, but in their capacity to include, support, and inspire everyone committed to serving something greater than themselves.